movement is guilty. Guilty because it has not been able to enact or get any results on the promises that it has been making for decades. For long, feminist movement has assumed that men have the incentive to change, that they have the capacity to change, and that continued messaging along these lines will finally result in a more equal relationship. The case from opening government is simple. This is never going to happen. The tipping point for this is extremely marginal and speculative. The resources of the feminist movement are better spent making sure that women get out of relationships or are at least able to choose their relationships far better before they get into them. First, on model and how this is going to be done. We think the feminist movement is going to do this in a couple of ways. The first is that they will of course provide legal support. So we think this debate is not only about single women in their 20s. Singlehood also applies to married women in their 40s, women who want to get divorced and get out of these relationships. The feminist movement is going to provide legal support to ensure that these things are accessible to these women and they can get these opportunities. Second, we're going to pass more counter narratives that prove that why singlehood is better. So things like my happiness comes first and I'm not going to sacrifice on these things just to appease a man or to appease my parents. Those are the sorts of narratives that we're going to fuel and give the head start. But third, we're going to provide more support structures. So of course, women of all ages and regardless of structure need some level of emotional support. They go through really taxing lives and things like that. We're going to provide more self-help groups and more places where they can get the sorts of emotional validation that can tell them that the choices that they're making are better. But thirdly, we're just going to have more money and advocate for things that make better job opportunities available for these women. So things like having direct access to credit, for example, or things like advocating for schemes where women who even don't have jobs are still able to get some level of money, but also things like pushing for diversity pushes within corporations. These are trends that we're already going to do. We're just going to continue to fuel these in bigger scales. The first argument coming from opening government is simple, is that this increases the threshold for women staying and getting into relationships. Sure.
Does the feminist movement have the money to do all the direct credit lending and working?
You advocate for these things, like that's what I'm saying, and that's one part of the model, so you can still do other things. Both need to assume that some level of money exists, otherwise no messaging can happen, that's one flash. First, what is the problem in status quo? I want to note that women face massive amounts of pressures to get into relationships right now, and this forces them into cycles of harm. Firstly, this looks like your family is telling you that your only purpose is to get married so that we can get some level of dowry. It means families telling you that you ought to quit your job because your life purpose is to bring us grandchildren and things like that. These pressures exist symmetrically from your own family, so support structures that you have to trust, but more specifically from the in-laws and like the parents of the relationship that you get into. But secondly, there are religious pushes that often come as well. So religion tells you about how fertility matters so much and things like that, and about why living alone or being a divorcee is so condemnable because you've already sacrificed your life and are bound to this one person for 7 lives and things like that. But thirdly, I think there's a massive amount of social pressure that forces you into these relationships. Women face massive amounts of shame and judgment when they try to leave. They're seen as sluts if they're, pardon my language, but those are the sorts of social messaging narratives that go on, when they're slut shamed for having multiple partners, and that often means that women want to stay within relationships that are non-romantic because they're afraid of the types of judgment they're going to get if they end up leaving and getting someone else. But thirdly, there is massive amounts of dependence that often ends up getting created within relationships. Of course, women don't have equal access and opportunities to jobs and things like that, which means that when you get into relationships, when you get into marriages, you become dependent on the man and their coercive family for money, for things like emotional support and things like that. But lastly, there's just a massive sum cost, so you feel like you've given enough time, and these women end up having the same hope that the feminist movements tell them to have, which is that men will organically get better and this relationship is worth saving. The implication of all of this is straightforward. First, women end up struggling and suffering in significantly bad relationships for themselves, and I want to note this is massively harmful for them. You stay in relationships of abuse, you stay within emotionally taxing places where the man just refuses to put in equal effort, and we think this ends up tiring the woman even more. They struggle because not only are they coerced and deprived of their choice, but they also now lack the ability to be able to manage multiple things, and this just ends up being far stressful for them. But even in our worst case, we think women just end up settling for men who often don't deserve their time, they don't deserve their love. I think these are the sorts of relationships that end up happening. What is the unique thing we're able to change with our policy? First, we think the calculus ends up shifting. Even if some of our alternatives end up working to some extent, so if legal support is slightly better, this means the massive financial cost that women face to get a divorce in the first place, the access to an attorney, the access to funds to be able to do this, makes the friction far more better. But secondly, we think the opportunities that we're able to provide is massive. So you no longer have to be as dependent on this one family for your decision making. You no longer have to be as dependent on this one person for your emotional validation. We think the creation of the sorts of policies that we talk about are better. The impacts of this are threefold. First, women just face far less friction. This means that you now have the ability to act on the choices that you were doing. Women consider leaving relationships all of the time, and it's exactly the narrative we tell you about why this ends up coercing, that forces them to stay in these things. We think, at least when the feminist movement passes narratives, why this is a justifiable choice, why you're not actually losing out in the ways that religion tells you to do and things like that you're able to do these things, that you're able to think that life is better and you have a purpose. I think these sorts of narratives end up being significantly better than on their side, because on their side they have to necessitate women stay in these relationships, and then they have to prove that these relationships end up getting better. But secondly, we think this is able to direct men to get massive amounts of change, and this is crucial within this debate. They need to prove, men need to now prove why their behavior is sufficient to make women change. This means that men end up being more chivalrous, so you take these women out on more dates, you don't act and show microaggressions to these individuals, you don't end up bullying these women and calling them names on the street, and you don't end up doing all of these things. This means that when women have the impetus and they're able to shift the calculus and it's easier for them to shift, I think men become significantly more scared. It is not as easy for you to now convince women to stay within bad relationships, and this forces men to increase the amount of effort that they put into this. This also extends to marriages, where if divorce becomes significantly easier, then you just can't carry on being a shitty husband. You have to take care of your child. You have to make sure that you're getting up and changing the diapers and not only putting these pressures and gender roles onto women. You end up being far more considerate, and in our worst case, we think we're able to direct men to at least get somewhat better. But thirdly, we just think women end up taking more amounts of time before getting into relationships. When we're able to validate that staying single is a good choice and it's a justifiable choice, the pressures on women that they feel vulnerable to with religion and all of the things that I noted earlier are significantly lesser. If pressures are less, then you're able to take more time judging potential mates, so you don't just end up going for the first person that often shows you some level of care, and you don't end up getting drowned into the social expectations of being with this person, but rather you can take more time and you can end up being far better and choosing better partners for yourself in the long term. Why is all of this better than their comparative that they have to defend? First, this is direct messaging. On their side, they have to be soft with their messaging about how bad men are, because they need to get cooperation from men. This means that you can't call them out on their worst sorts of behavior, which means that you have to validate some of their choices. So you have narratives on their side that say, yeah, maybe you have a job and that's fine, but could you at least take 1 hour to help your child or to help your wife? I think these sorts of narratives minimize the amount of impact that they can get and force men to change. But secondly, men on their side never have an impetus to change, because there is no threat of this woman leaving and this relationship ending. We think we're far more direct and proximate in the harm that we're able to cause, and therefore we shift the incentives for men to change in a far more direct way. Opening up.
Thanks, please.
I will prove in my speech how Gov tries to reach the same impacts as us, but with extra mechanisms. I will answer 3 questions in my speech. First, on why this narrative doesn't exist in vacuum, and there are other competing narratives that Gov has to deal with before they can prove the impacts of the benefits. This means that none of the Gov impacts matter if they are never able to prove the solvency or the opt-in into any of their advocacy. My first question to Gov teams is that what does this kind of advocacy look like in face of other competing narratives? What are these competing narratives? They say these are bad narratives. I think they're just naturally existing narratives around society that would force people to be in relationships. One, you're extremely young, and through young age you're told that at the end of the young age you need to marry someone and you have to have a partner, you have to have a family, because this is good and happy and it gives you a legacy. Second, this is just given to familial values, how you see your parents grow up, how you see your parents take your mom take your dad out on a date, or how your parents' marriage albums makes you feel like, oh, why was I not at that wedding? I want a wedding that is much more grander. But also through religions who push you towards the fact that this is important for you, this is important for your society and community, this is how you build community, and this is how you build community values. But then also through rom-com and pop culture that glorifies the idea and probably sets a positive ideals to these people. That means that shows that it's cute to be in a relationship. It makes your heart warm when you see someone taking you out on a date. It feels cute to cuddle with someone. There are movies that are extremely sad and sappy that makes you feel you want to hug someone out, hug someone, cuddle and sleep all night and hold their hands and go on cute dates, or probably be in a romantic country. But then lastly, I think sex is just great. I think the idea is that you get intimacy with relationships, and intimacy and intimate sex means that it releases oxytocin, which is literally called the love hormone. I think these are all precursor narratives that exist in the face of why people are pushed towards relationships, and these relationships are important for people on multiple levels. They can go out and analyze how much of these narratives are like negative and pressure, but I think there's enough counter-analysis to prove that at some point these narratives are positive and actually help people and make these people happier and give them some level of happiness, because at the end of the day you need companionship, and this companionship different from other forms of companionship because you see other people around you see people in relationships. This means that when you feel heartbreak, you want you want someone, you want a particular person to be there for you. You want your own person and stuff like that. This is important. This means that the ability for people to opt into singledom kind of advocacy is really less. This means that women feel alienated towards it, and I will prove that the amount of women that opt into singledom narrative is extremely less. This automatically proves that even if they have the benefits that they say, it only affects a very small group of people. We affect much more larger on scale. Why is this true? One, the role models are just really niche and unaware. I think the ability for women or people on the internet or other stalwarty women which go out and say be single, live your life is extremely less. This means that you can probably opt into Arundhati Roy, who probably not a lot of people know of, or probably don't engage with a lot of politics because this narrative is extremely complex and different. Or you can just look at Zendaya, who's extremely happy with like the Spider-Man guy and want to live their life and everyone wants to be with him and stuff like that. This means that it's much more accessible to people to romanticize and be happy about relationships. But then secondly, even if this is true, the conversion is just really limited, right? This means the people who opt into this kind of narrative are just people who just come up from extremely niche urban backgrounds who think that yes, I will prioritize my singledom, I'll prioritize being single and stuff like that. This is true because one, they've come from extremely high amounts of privilege in a society that can actually actualize their agency. This is not a narrative that's true to most amount of women. This is probably someone who is Bandra and like some has like a really chic name and some who lives in like a really big house and stuff like that. This means that at best this is performative and it's extremely hard for people to cope with loss and stuff like that. The TLDR of all of this analysis proves that one, it's really hard for people to opt into singledom, but secondly, the people who opt into this is really less, that automatically limits the kind of benefit that they have. We don't want to benefit Bandra chicks, we want to benefit women on a large scale. What is the opt imperative and why is it important? The kind of advocacy that we give is one, important to two types of women, urban and rural women. We will prove that by this going to have agency and ability to both overcome and show some more solvency than what they have done. One, we need to have much more amount of impacting towards rural women, and that is good because they face the worst harms of patriarchy. This means like things like dowry, this means like not being able to use menstruation pads or not even toilets in your house. This is all true because you probably have unequal power in this relationship, and your ability to go out and propagate narratives against this in the advocacy that you have on opposition is much more important. And solving this is much more important because this type of misogyny is internalized in nature and women don't even know about it. This means that even if you don't accomplish large benefits at a structural level, we still tell women there is much more self-awareness. This is the most proximate and certain benefit you solve when you have NGOs. Why is this much more accessible than what they say? I think one, because it's much more bigger impact. These women never get freedom, they're never heard a voice, they're pushed to rare kids, multiple amounts of kids and never asked why. They have very less lack of community. I think this is one, much more palatable to NGOs because they can sell this idea towards funders who can probably fund this kind of advocacy. This is important to them. But secondly, this gives them much more media optics. It's much more easier for them to go out and tell women about community within rural areas because community is important. This means there's a larger the inaction problem within women in rural areas is solved because now they can rely on narratives of sisterhood and probably pushing back against the male in the relation. That's important. This means this one helps much more women on scale, but secondly helps much more important women on scale, and this thing needs to exist on a certainty because this exists just on the self-awareness that we can give to these women, and that's much more important. Closing.
What ground panchayat level formula are you getting to be more equal in a relationship? Of course, this debate can't happen in a rural context where feminist movement to break in is already marginal.
I proved that why feminist movement has much more propensity to break into these because it's much more palatable and you can sell this idea, they can get funds. If none of this happens, you can at least build sisterhood. But if they don't want to engage with the rural part, I'll go on to the urban part. Why is this important for urban women? I think the concession is really simple. You have much more feminist influence and narratives around breadcrumbing and manipulation that we saw on our side within urban women because you talk more about it. This is important because it's unequal, and when men breadcrumb women, it's a bad thing. I'm not sure why we have to make concessions against men. I think that's an assertion on their side. You don't have to negotiate. We can just create more advocacy and certainty because now you have much more sisterhood and community. This is important for urban women as well because they face the most amount of difficulty because one, there's just like unequal standards of how much job that you need to do as a child. This means that paternalistic roles are divided on women doing cooking and house stuff. This means that you have to now change these narratives. I think this kind of advocacy helps push back against no, I want to work a job, I will not take care of kids all the time. I think this is much more proximate towards urban women as well. Probably them prioritizing STEM fields or working after they're married and stuff like that are much more proximate towards urban women. We also saw because we now have a community and this advocacy helps them. The weight of all of this is that we feel much more pride and joy, which is much more palatable to you, you affect more, you help more women on scale. This leads to a larger opt-in. So even if we don't prove our benefits to the biggest extent, we prove the scale of impact to a larger extent because more people opt into this, and that's the unique impact that you get on open knowledge.
Does opening opposition explain how they make things better for women? They say, oh, we will somehow do advocacy without making concessions while being palatable, and relationships magically become better. Then all their analysis literally goes to strengthen our case in terms of why there is so much pressure and so much impetus to force women into the shackles of relationship, to cage their lives down and to restrict their agency and freedom. They do absolutely nothing to solve that, and they're unwilling to take a stance against those that continue to perpetrate these sorts of harms. The first thing I want to note is they cannot go ahead and gain any margin on how much they can change relationships, especially in rural areas, because the people over there are just too far too conservative to want to believe any of the benefits that they want to talk about. Who the fuck in a rural area is going to worry about breadcrumbing or manipulation when they're probably beating on the women in their house on a regular, which they think is their birthright because they think women is their property. None of their messaging actually ends up being effective in the rural area, so they end up cutting out their own margin. Even more likely, if they want to talk about the people in the urban area, notice that change only comes when men take accountability and feel culpable for the problem. But on their side, you say, oh, actually this is kind of bad, don't do this, or you be palatable. If you are palatable, then presumably you feel like you're not doing anything wrong, and maybe at best you make really minor changes which still continue to perpetrate all the sorts of harms and negligence towards women that end up existing in status quo. The third thing I want to note is that they falsely assume that OG case requires everyone to opt into singledom for our benefits to exist. This is not the case, because even if we will just say by just campaigning for this itself is inherently good. The first thing that they say is, oh, people don't opt in. So we act on our absolute worst case, are just able to discuss multiple reasons for why you ought not to get into a relationship. At our absolute worst case, this is another source of information that helps women make more informed choices about entering relationships in the first place. Therefore, on relationships, we're able to increase the amount of information that a woman has when they go ahead and make a choice. The choice is far more informed on our side. On this, I just want to complete why, even if this campaigning is done in the most unsuccessful way, it is still better. The first thing I want to note is all of the reasons that I talk about still point to the fact that relationships are something that are inherently damaging and inherently unequal towards women. If that is the case, then we think that the fact that singledom is more desirable and relationships are not equal is something that is factually more true, and therefore as a feminist movement, if you ought to support and prioritize something that's factually more true, you're leaning with the truth more, which is more moral than leaning with the falsity and trying to convince women that the world will somehow change in the future without ever actually changing action on that. We're more moral in the way that we go ahead and choose to make a decision and campaign. This is independent of the impact of how successful this campaigning is. The second is on counter narratives. I've already talked to you about why it gives more choice, but the second point is all of the analysis on why there are so many narratives to convince you to relationships literally proves that this is probably the only single source from where you can get information about why singledom is good, why it is something that it is valid to think about, why you are not a devil or a home wrecker or someone for even thinking about these sorts of things. This being the only form of solace means that this is something that uniquely helps women, and it is the feminist movement obligation to look after women, especially those that are left behind by the feminist movement. Insofar as they don't go ahead and do this, they are not representing the interests of women. Therefore, this is something that is better to do regardless of what the outcome is. But on the outcome in and of itself, the first thing I want to talk about is how do people interact with the messaging on either side. On our side, we tell women that you can leave relationships because leaving relationships is better. On their side, somehow they have to tell men to make relationships more welcoming for women. There has multiple layers of indirectness over here. One, how many men actually even subscribe to the feminist movement to tap into this ideology in the first place? Two, how many men actually care about what women want to point where they actually realize that there are certain things that they want to create for these women, or what is actually good or what is bad. 3, how many men actually feel culpable for the wrongs that they inflict generation upon women. We think all of these are quite uncertain, but most importantly, there is no threat of punitive action on their side, because on their side, if they say that, oh, your relationship is bad, the woman should leave, then they're crossing the house and they're arguing for our side. It's only on our side that we're able to threaten men with not having relationships. I think the most reasonable margin within this debate is that at least some women stop opting into relationships, or opt into lesser relationships, or do a lot more consideration before they opt into one, right? We think this means that a lot of men are structurally deprived of relationships, which means they're losing out on something. We think this is the first point of them to getting them to confront with the problem itself, because this is why they actually start caring about, oh, why am I not getting a relationship? On the comparative, they continually have a roster of women on their relationship that they're able to cycle through just by saying, oh, I was like marginally better than the previous one. Haha, I'm so cool, like more women should date me, I'm 6'4" by the way. We think all of that literally means that there's no meaningful change of behavior on their side, whereas on our side, we think that's far more likely that at least they realize that they're doing something wrong. The second layer is, the comparative for this on our side, is the feminist movement does this messaging to women, which means a lot more women are in tune with the feminist movement, which means it's far more likely that they understand what the feminist movement is talking about, and they're far more likely to realize the sort of messaging itself. So even if they want to push it, we think more women do opt into singledom. Yeah. Actually, it's closer. Yeah, go ahead.
Your burden should prove that given that there are so many narratives for relationship, why the single narrative convinces people to opt into singledom.
We don't have to convince people to opt into singledom, even if we provide them information that they cannot get from anywhere else, because every narrative is so overwhelming in terms of telling them that they have to be in a relationship. This is something that improves their choice and something that improves their agency. Lastly, on things like media call out or things like that, they're just super fucking uncomparative, but I'd posit to you that it's far more likely that we get a lot more engagement when we take a hardline stance. It's likely to receive more criticism, more engagement on social media, more shares, more retweets, more reason to platform yourself on the media. We think this gives the actual tangible benefits to go ahead and surface the feminist movement in and of itself in the first place. Not only does this radicalism actually bring more attention, it forces punitive action upon those that push the worst harms on them and forces them to confront the worst parts of them to bring about change. Last thing I want to talk about is why this raises the threshold for women that actually do want to enter relationships, and why this makes existing relationships much better. Notice that now to enter a relationship, it's insufficient for a man to meet the bare minimum. A man has to prove that they are a good investment of time and better than being alone, which means that a woman does enter, they're far more fulfilled. Their physical needs are met a lot more, their spiritual and emotional needs are met a lot more. We think on net this means less women are abused for those reasons, both opening up.
Dad is a surgical oncologist and her mom is a pediatric care specialist. They are probably the most accomplished couple I know. They both run marathons. Despite making the same amount of money and holding a similarly important job, like her mom still feels the need to make food for everyone in the world. I don't think a large scale of people that they're talking about are actually relevant in this motion. Because if something was so urgent, they don't need someone to tell you to leave. They probably will leave in most instances anyways. I'll get to that later. But what I wanted to note is a lot of it is internalized misogyny, and that's what affects women on an everyday basis. And that's what we're able to convince on our side, and I'll explain why we're able to do that. Because she is well educated and smart, and I honestly don't think it is worth on putting their marriage because of something they don't even know. They don't even know that this is wrong. They don't even know this is something that they should be wrong. What opening government tells you is when these people don't even know, you go and tell them, actually, you know what? Quit the marriage, leave the relationship. I don't think that's good because these people have been in a relationship for 25 years, 30 years, and they have got a lot of value from it. I think they value their marriage a lot. When you tell that, that's when they opt out of the messaging. What we tell is a lot more relatable to them, and then we're probably able to create more impact. I want you to know, I think we can illustrate and empower her, and we can tell her that, hey, you can just choose not to cook her food, and then she will probably listen, and her dad will also probably listen. I want to first explain why this is significantly easier to do than what opening governments doing on their side. I have five layers to this. First, I want convince someone who's been in a marriage, who believes in a relationship, that you can make your situation better. Because the opt-in is a lot easier instead of saying leave the marriage. For all the reasons that Yasho says, you will be slut-shamed, you will not be able to live without a marriage, all these things, this motion does not exist in a vacuum. Which means when we tell them, hey, you can actually just make the relationship a little bit better, fight for your voice, say you will not cook food, say you will not take care of your kids because you also work in an equally demanding job. I think that's when more people are able to opt into it compared to what they're saying. So they have a problem, right? They say, what exactly does this look like on our side, and what does the advocacy look like on our side? I think it's simple, right? This looks like influencer campaigns or campaigns that say no to cooking. These are things that you can do very subtly, right? You can get a lot more, feminist influencers to like spam like Instagram reels where you are able to use confirmation bias to force people to believe this is true. That's already happened in a lot of political change. Look at all the political change that's happened in the recent time. Like there is a lot of like influence of short-term content in this. But also you can do things like producing movie scripts that influence young women to claim their right in a relationship. This is already happening in how liberal we've already become in changing the way this narrative is consumed. I think this messaging is very, very different, right? Because it makes them feel like they're part of the system, but they can make the system feel better. But their messaging is abusive and harassing to whatever they've already believed in for so long. And that means a lot of people who are already married can't ever opt into their content anyways, because the moment they see it, they're like, hey, this is insane. I think then they say, look, we want to do things like advocate for legal aid and stuff. Unless Yasho's dad is paying for this shit, I don't know who the fuck is paying for this legal aid. Because I wanted to know, right? Funding is a lot easier to get on our side. And why is it easier? Because I think it's easier to get funding for the kind of advocacy we want, because rich urban women face the problems that we are talking about. They face the problem of, I am actually I'm doing the same job as my husband. Why do I have to work extra? Why do I have to prepare for my, take care of my kids and things like that? Which means more urban women will give money to our side of campaigning, but they'll never give money to Yasho's side of campaigning because I don't know who's giving campaigning for them. But lastly, I think I want to know, right? There is a high barrier of opt-in, which means I want to just show why they have higher ROI, right? Because if an influencer says, slay girl, say no to cooking or whatever, 50, 60-year-olds will opt into it. They will believe in her and they will genuinely admit to it and they'll opt into it. But I want to know on the comparative, right? What is their advocacy doing? Like, think about going and telling a horny teenager who's listening to Taylor Swift songs about love her whole life and thinking some guy will come save her and things like that, oh, actually, boys are actually bad, you shouldn't actually go and date them, and that's like so cool. I don't think anybody is buying that shit, right? That's just funny, I'm sorry. Sid, just think of how many parents say, don't get into a relationship, focus on your studies, and how many kids actually follow that. Why the fuck are teenagers going to actually accept the narrative that they're saying? They should have spent more effort on showing how the narrative looks like and why the fuck teenagers will actually opt into it. They did not do that, they fucked up, you lost right there. So the simple impact of this is very simple, right? For every dollar we spend, we convert more people to actually feel like, you should ask for more in your relationship. What that means is we can convert 100 people for the same money they're spending to convert one person, which means for a resource-constrained movement like feminism, on scale we are able to win over them. On the comparative, I think they're not able to do anything. I think the next thing I want to do here is just on the extreme cases, because I think I want to just cut it out. I don't think we should get into this. The first thing I want to note is this is a prioritized motion. So the absolute worst cases where someone is in abuse or they are suffering marital rape, we're not going to be like, oh, go stay with the guy. We can say, no, you shouldn't stay with the guy. That is within the motion because it's a prioritized motion. We are just saying that we don't need advocacy for that because it's already an urgent enough situation. There's enough people telling her to leave. There's enough people who love her to telling her to leave. There's enough police cases that's telling her to leave. I don't know how many women are so insane that they will not leave any of the rest. We are okay taking the trade-off insofar as they're able to fight internalized misogyny. But I think in the absolute worst case, right, they'll leave anyway. I think it's okay. You don't need someone to tell them. The last thing I have a problem with is why will men listen? I think it's very simple, right? Look at the large scale of these urban women, or it's not just urban women, right? It's like a huge chunk of population who are reasonably educated, who are working and stuff like that. I think men are willing to listen if the messaging is in the way that we say it, right? I mean, if both of you are working in the same job, why should I cook is something that most men can palliatively understand. And if they want to extremely characterize men as the most evil, I don't know, someone from Bhagalpur that Yashovardhan talks about, I really can't help it, right? I think the flip of this is very simple. It gets a lot worse in Yashovardhan's side Because once the men understand that this messaging is so horrible, the legal aid group is saying things like leave me, I think that's when they become a lot more aggressive towards the movement, and that movement will suffer a lot more consequences. The movement that was distributing free pads can't distribute anymore because the man is scared that the woman will leave. So they will not let her go to that self-help group. They will not let her go and take the free pads. They will not let her go and take the education. This is incredibly bad in the rural settings, and that's the flip that makes him a lot worse. I think it's very simple. It's just like we are able to create a lot more impact for the money we spend, and our messaging is in a way that's more nuanced, where more people can opt into it, and I think their messaging is just in a horrible way that actually makes women's lives worse for all these reasons.
Starting my speech, well, opening opposition goes ahead and says you get some kind of catharsis when you go ahead and see your parents' albums, and you go ahead and see people being in happy relationships. That means they also say feminism should go ahead and push for something like this, which people get catharsis. The message you go ahead and send with something like this is you go ahead and say, oh, you are only complete when you go ahead and get a partner. That means you essentially reinforce certain patriarchal norms that exist in society, which everything feminism stood against. They always stood for autonomy, they always stood for independence. The moment you go ahead and say, conform to this social norm that exists, you go ahead and lose out on the NGO funding that they were telling you. Because if you are not sticking to the core idea feminism always spoke about, you lose out on that. Second, they tell you, oh, our own parents don't ask you to don't get into relationships. How will they go ahead and tell you to get married to certain people? That's completely different, right? Most people in the global south have conservative parents. Most people in developed countries are still orthodox. They still push for their kids to go get married early, etc., and understand how that comparative is true. With that, what do we say? Well, the main problem that feminism had throughout the last century is that they don't have collectivization to go and put enough pressure to get policy change. How do we then fix this on closing opposition? It's very simple. Because feminism support is so fragmented, the reason it is this way is because all of them have different issues as to why they opt into feminism. That means they don't relate to everything that happens. On our side, you go ahead and have something that most people can relate to. That is, they have been in abusive relationships. That means they have been coerced into relationships. They have gotten into relationships because of fear, because of backlash from society, because a society goes ahead and tells you that this is a compulsion of adulthood, etc. and etc. That means most people can go ahead and collectivize now. That means the fragmented support that existed is now collective support. Why? Let's understand. Rural women, even though they don't understand the idea of feminism, still don't need to read feminist literature to understand that they're in an abusive relationship. They don't need to read feminist literature to go and understand that probably being single, the other woman who's being single is probably happier than me, and I am probably struggling in this relationship that I really want to get out of. Right? With that being said, we go ahead and achieve some kind of collectivization. With this collectivization, we believe feminism can later on push some kind of policy pressure on institutions that exist, which will later lead to some kind of mobilization of this women, which is where the problem of this motion exists. Moving on. Whatever opening opposition said about them going ahead and pushing narratives through media and that reaching rural places, that means you go ahead and legitimize certain belief and you go ahead and establish a tier divide. That means you go ahead and tell these women that you are probably better off than single women, and you create a tier divide between women that exist, that are single women versus married women. And these married women being already coming from certain conservative backgrounds have more reasons to go ahead and hate single women. That means the already existing societal norm that being single is bad probably becomes worse, and they always look at women who are single as and always shame them and be like, this is not how you should be. With that, what do we then say on closing government? Well, let's understand. The moment feminism goes ahead and pushes for singlehood to be more desirable, that means we go ahead and go ahead and remove the idea that the relationship is your final goal of life. The relationship is your compulsion of adulthood. That means we shift the focus for these women to go ahead and get some kind of careers, to go ahead and get some sources of belonging outside of this relationship. That means my dad does not have to go ahead and tell my sister, oh, marry this man, he's rich. He probably has to go ahead and he probably won't have to tell this to my sister. My sister will probably go ahead and probably get a job, get some kind of economic independence. The moment she gets some kind of economic independence, she gets a bargaining chip, not just in this romantic relationship, but in all kind of relationships that exist. The moment they have some kind of bargaining chip, they have some kind of say, they have some kind of autonomy, they have some kind of freedom that exists, that does not exist in status quo. The problem with problem with pushing for equal relationships. It's harder to go ahead and secure when the social default is still rewarding coupling, but rewarding people getting together, but not care about the quality of the relationship. Do not care about if the women are happy or not. The moment this is how society is, you go ahead and still tell them, oh, getting married, being together is something that's better off. You don't go ahead and solve the problem that exists, because then women are still going to stay because they think that they should go ahead and stay in this relationship. They'll stay because they think society is saying, oh, being in a relationship is what matters the most, not because they truly want to be in this relationship. If singlehood goes ahead and becomes more desirable, it goes ahead and increases the quality of relationships, and hence we can go ahead and achieve what opposition tries to do, is getting an equal relationship. What is we pushing? Yeah.
So both governments have this wrong. On our side of the house, you still disseminate the information of what an equal relationship looks like. You know, you still put a significant burden before you enter that relationship so that it is an equal relationship.
I still don't understand how you go ahead and say, oh, both people can be equal relationship, because power dynamics is essentially pushed from social narratives. You live in a patriarchal society, you can never go ahead and you will never be able to go ahead and achieve that balance that exists unless you go ahead and change how every man thinks. Moving on, what's the impact of this construct? The impact is very simple. You have fewer coerced relationships. Women go ahead and are able to stand on their own feet and get into relationships that they want, get into relationships that they think are probably on an equal level. Moving on. But yeah, with that, closing off.
Okay, beginning in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel opening opposition has run away from the debate because they will not engage with any degree about the way that this movement, even if it just campaigns for it, this messaging and this information exists in social media spaces and other spaces, and they simply say this will not change anything on the ground because people who are married in villages will not want to divorce, will not want to become single. That's not the point. It doesn't engage with the principal arguments, and for those reasons, opening opposition simply has run away from taking a first or a second. The problem with their case is they assume exclusivity. That is, they say that the only way to encourage an equal relationship is to tell women that men are extremely bad, men cannot be people who change, men cannot make good decisions, men don't care about you, and therefore you have a higher standard. That's the only way you can sort of make women expect more, as opposed to a different mechanism which exists on our side, which is literally equality-based relationships, where you tell what an equal relationship is and how it should go, and that is the case from side closing opposition. The first thing I want to talk about is why advocacy of increased singlehood comes hand in hand with demonizing men. A, because advocacy is centered around singlehood and always by default talking about how men are not worth the struggle. Other words, going into all of that with. We will agree with you for now. But second, because men are not capable of being loving, not capable of changing, not capable of being understanding of any of the struggles or problems. But also it looks like how every woman is told you are wholly sufficient on your own, because this is the only way you can tell women to accept singledom and to acknowledge that for the rest of their life potentially, because there are already so many narratives talking about how relationships are amazing and true love and whatnot. So the only way you can tell a woman to not opt into all of that is by telling her you can do it yourself and you don't need anybody in your life. Notice on top of that what happens is, for increased opt-in by women, a lot of the time you emote and tap into existing emotional messaging on things like social media, where you have extremists who have the largest voices because the algorithm pops up extremist views to keep content going, to keep people's eyes on it. That is both content for women who are consuming it and also suggested to men as well on social media to increase viewership, because it creates a kind of emotional reaction from both points of view, which means it's something that becomes a top of the algorithm, which means it suggests to more people watch it, becomes a vicious cycle. So the extreme content is generally in social media and other places. The one is most popped up. This is the same thing that happens in regular news media as well, which is slower, or blogs or things like that, but just in a longer time scale. Social media is just a faster version of it, but extreme media is the one that bubbles on top first. Notice these kinds of extreme media tell women are inherently better than men. They tell that men are evil, all men are cheaters, all men are useless. They say that men cannot change, and at this point becomes vicious cycle where this becomes the most opted into narrative for people who are on the media, and this is the most engaged with, and this engagement itself drives further engagement. What happens then is, see, you have a bandwagon effect caused because of this, where women A, who might not agree with this initially, cannot oppose it because it seems to be, in their perception, the main view of the feminist movement and the community and the people later. What this means is the capacity to opt out, or the capacity to say no, reduces insofar there's so much extreme significant significant volume of messaging which is there to say the men suck. On top of that, these obviously people who want to be left out and you want to show yourself part of a group, and through groupism and tribalism behavior ingrained into our own biology, women are then told to emulate the behavior of the most extreme person of the group to justify your existence in that social circle, which implies everybody is emulating the worst behaviors of the kind of groups that exist that demonize men. Notice then that this justifies and strengthens inceldom and the manosphere against men in society. Part 1 of this is the default state of relationships isn't that men will do more to prove themselves on your side. Rather, notice what happens is, it is A, women will avoid relationships in general because they told they are enough and don't need men, and means you don't even settle for somebody who might be nice, who might be good, because the risk is so high. You don't know what a good man may do later. So you don't even adjust for a good man. You don't even try to be the man of choice. Instead, you just stay single. I keep the man single as well. B, it tells women to justify the worst of their own behavior. If I cheat, if I do something wrong to my partner, if I fight with my partner, it is justified because men suck and men don't deserve love and men don't are not kind people. They've oppressed us for time immemorial. But see, the more and more you the relationship, so the narratives tell you these kinds of things, you say that I don't need anyone, which reduces your ability to work through difficulties, conflicts in relationships, which means your ability to have a long-term sustaining loving relationship reduces significantly at the point where you opt out from relationship is so low, but any random single fight, you can just say, oh, instead of working through this and figuring out what is actually equal between both of us, I will instead fuck off because I don't think you're worth my time and I'm a bad bitch, which is fair, and I will do it all alone. On top of that, which means you won't have relationships on their side, you will have more alone people on their side instead. What this means is the environment will necessarily become A, increased difficulty to enter relationships for all people in this way, or B, visible open hatred on all media spheres against men by authority figures of the women community who want to opt into the bandwagon to increase the popularity, to maintain the strength over their voter bases, to maintain their clout, to maintain their celebrity status, which ultimately means that you create an overall sense of fear of hopelessness in the society in terms of finding love, true engagement with people and heartfelt things like that. Part 3 to this is then why these people will then come under susceptible fear of the manosphere. No, and I will take A, because this narrative of hating men validates existing manosphere messaging. They say we were right all along, you didn't believe us back then, believe us right now, see the headlines, see the newspaper, see it everywhere, the women hate you, I told you, you should believe me now for what happened in the future. But B, men are then increasingly under all sorts of pressure in society, from families to have children, to have marriage, to get to earn money, inflating economy and all sorts of problems, which means that as well as those existing bases, and finally this leads to an increased loneliness in general because of the way social media exists. At this point, then there's emotional vacuum which has to be filled by somebody, which is then filled by these manosphere people who then establish misogynistic takes and things like that, which are then inculcated over time. Even nice people in society who feel hopeless will then turn to manosphere because they're the only ones who are willing to engage with their reality and tell them, yes, it sucks for you, and therefore these nice people are then also forced into that situation. On the comparative, the manosphere isn't as powerful to take these men because of equality-focused messaging being on the alternative. And notice, power dynamics exist, yes, but that's the point of equality-based messaging is to fight the power dynamics. You're fighting the power dynamics on either side of this debate. On their side, you're fighting the power dynamics by saying fuck men, or not really, but the other way. But on our side, we're saying fuck men, and we're not saying fuck men, we're saying fuck men the other way actually, you get the idea. Now, A, because men's worth or value is not determined by the nature of the state of things they can't change. Rather, the value on equality-based messaging is on the effort. How much time do you put in the relationship? How much other things you put in the relationship? How much are you giving to women? Are you treating them nicely? And these are things you encourage on our side, which promotes healthy relationships on our side. But B, the manosphere itself seems unreasonable right now because equality is a very strong narrative force in society. Democracy, rights, fairness, chivalry, and exit for time immemorial implies that things like equality, the manosphere then will become reduced on our side because we won't be as enviable to join. But see, equality-based messaging also eases burden from men at the point where you encourage discourse-based conflict management, things like that, to increase length of relationships. Ultimately, increase antagonism towards women is bad, increase passive aggressiveness. In the office place, less men stand up for you, less men give you promotion. Fair language is removed in terms of misogynistic language. Women are more catcalled, harassed in public. It goes over time, over places. You are never left alone, you never left safe. And for those reasons, women are much worse off in this debate. For those reasons, closing opposition.
Azra going as duck whip, she, her pronouns, pure, I will take it from either people.
Wait, before that, I completely forgot to ask for speaker always.
entrenching that the possibility of solvency is really, really difficult. Even if society doesn't actively tell women that they should stay in bad relationship, this is the expectation that still exists for people, right? This happens in a few ways. One, societal norms at all point tell me that it's probably better to sacrifice and stay in this relationship than go ahead and be lonely or be a widow, be lonely or like die alone at 50. But two, I also have my own family and my own people who are proximate to me telling me that not getting married or not getting into a relationship is the worst possible outcome that could possibly exist. It's the worst possible outcome that could possibly exist. The problem is that this normalizes abnormal things in relationship, because the minute that you are told that sacrifice is the expectation, you are yourself going to go ahead and internalize the idea of being okay with certain things that you should not be okay with, which never gets solved on opposition. We agree with Uji when they go ahead and say the possibility of leveraging men to go ahead and support the feminist movement is very, very difficult to begin with. I don't know why these men wouldn't have joined the movement in status quo to begin with. But the few men that do go ahead and support the feminist movement are probably men who have more access to liberal ideas, who are probably from the upper echelons of society. I don't think these people would go ahead and sway their support from feminism any which ways, because they know that the idea that we're pushing is not that men are bad or men are evil or that the men are the worst people to exist in society, but that if there is a choice to be made, and the choice is either stay in a bad relationship or stay single, staying single is the preferable thing to do. Not that you can never get into relationships or that relationships are inherently bad. I don't know why people who support the idea will go ahead and not support it at any point, but I also don't know why they are able to get more opt-ins at any point. We think that, but note the problem with the existence of counter-narratives that perpetuates these ideas that opposition comes in and talk about. You create some sort of divide amongst these women themselves, which means at all points you tell that even you are supposed to be married by 30 or 25, etc., you look down on women who are not. You look down on women who don't live up to these great ideals that society pushes on to you, but you also look down on your own family members who go ahead and stick it to the man and don't do the things that society expects of you, which means that at all points you have some sort of divide internally within the feminist movement to begin with. And this is precisely the problem that Mithun comes in and talks about. The feminist movement is currently not able to create change. One, because they don't have the support of men. This is not going to change on opposition. But two, because you don't have the support of women, because at all points your interests are told to be different. You're told that your interests as a married woman are not the same as your interests of a single woman somewhere, and that your ideologies or the things that you're supposed to be fighting for are really, really different. And this is the problem, right? At all points, insofar as you're told that your values are different, the things that you're supposed to be fighting for are different, you're never able to go ahead and create some sort of collectiveness. You're never able to unite to create some change. You're never able to go ahead and create any sort of policy change or policy change or change at any scale. Insofar as you are unable to get collective unity, you will never be able to change the situation because of the counter narratives that they talk about. The more at some level, even if the scale to which you convince women is really, really low, we think that this is far better than an opposition. You're not able to leverage men into joining your movement, but you're also you also worsen the situation of women who themselves don't buy into the feminist movement. We think that this goes ahead and maybe in the long term builds more capacity to create change, which doesn't exist on opposition. This may be long term, sure, and we will concede to this, but this is far better than just appeasing to men or appeasing to society in the short term, because we think that even if at some point you're able to collectivize, you're able to lobby governments, you're able to lobby governments purely by the fact that you have more people supporting your movement, this is far more preferable to say just existing in society where patriarchy is so deeply entrenching or so deeply overarching in the values that exist in society. The only possibility of change is if you either are able to leverage men, which they don't do, or two, you're able to go ahead and create pressures on government, which only happens if you're able to lobby the women who are likely to support you. Panel on the idea of marginalized women, if they're as entrenching as they talk about, the change will never happen. Then who we try to go ahead and affect is probably people from the middle class who are closer to the ideals of feminism than say marginalized women who don't get solvency on our side. We think that long-term marginalized women still go ahead and benefit from this, because if more women are able to collectivize and create change, this trickles down to marginalized women as well. Sure.
Sharun specifically analyzes one type of messaging will antagonize men and they will further push back against the agency and autonomy of women.
Sure, I think these men would be antagonized anyways because they don't care about feminism. You don't prove why so many men care about feminism that they're willing to go ahead and create this change. Insofar as you don't prove this, I don't know why men are the people you're trying to get to opt into feminism to begin with. Or since that look, niche cases exist, then you can probably go ahead and tell women to like exit really toxic relationships anyways, but to that parents go ahead and tell you that you should be educated, you should get into relationships later. I don't think that this is the case for most women. Most women are told that a relationship is the ideal, that a marriage is the ideal. And I think this is just like not the case for most people, like by and far. We think that on opposition, even if you're able to, in specific situations, go ahead and tell women to opt out of bad relationships, we think that the narrative itself is really important, because you go ahead and create some sort of long-term change, you create some sort of long-term impact. Panel, neither opposition team actually has solvency. They don't prove why men opt in, but insofar as they're unable to prove why men opt in, they can never go ahead and create change in the long term or the short term. I don't care if in 100 years the history books call men bad. If I'm not able to impact women today who are suffering from the problem, like actively. Cool, I think with that I'll end my slides. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mistakenly say Rishabh instead of Archit. I'm just used to saying that. Habit. We're the only team in this debate who is actually competitive, because both the top half teams have the problem of discussing who is going to spread the narrative in a particular way. Opening up is incredibly uncompetitive on 3 separate points. The first count is that they say that you make informed choices before you get into a relationship. 2 responses. First, I would know that you can still disseminate information on our side of the house on what an equal relationship would look like, and you can still set the threshold of what the equal relationship should look like before you enter the relationship. So you can still disseminate information about what an equal relationship should look like and how it should interact with you. Secondly, you can still make this image incredibly popular, because you can still platform men who are actually feminist men and allow their women to have an equal relationship with them. So this does not let you or force you to antagonize men in the same way that CG and OG would suggest you do. Because on our side also, you can still platform men and glorify the men that are actually equal in their relationships and allow their women to propagate and live in a manner that actually helps them in the long term. Secondly, on rural areas, this is incredibly uncompetitive, because this is not where the debate takes place. If your husband does beat you in rural areas, there is no feminist narrative that can convince you to stop beating you either way. So if Yasho says that maybe we can somehow convince them emotionally that you shouldn't beat your woman, or that these women can in fact get out of the relationship by promoting singlehood, the narrative of promoting singlehood can never reach the rural areas. So they had a huge burden of explaining why these narratives are likely to reach. Third, opening government is right. A vast majority of women will get into relationships anyways, and it's hard to not be in one. Therefore, it's a waste of money for you to do this, insofar as a vast majority of women either will opt into relationships, or you make women feel guilty after they enter a relationship. So the entire top half is incredibly competitive, and Archit is the only one who ends up making this debate competitive. How do we end up winning this debate on a competitive? 2 separate ways. Firstly, we explained to you that Andrew Tate and the narrative that Andrew Tate ends up suggesting, or people who are part of the manosphere, end up becoming far stronger. This increases the narrative that all women are hating men, that all women would rather not be with men, and they are worthless creatures that you shouldn't be with. That singlehood is more desirable than wanting to die with a man who is not worth your time. And this increases the narrative that you are oppressed as a man. Andrew Tate can say to young boys that you are oppressed and you shouldn't interact with women. And the reason why they do this is to
counteract the narrative that men are in fact bad. They say that women are worthless, that you shouldn't be with women, that these women are the same creatures who end up constantly questioning your worth and hence they don't deserve your time. This is the ways in which you end up becoming more antagonistic towards these exact same women. Second, these people create fear that men will die single, that now they will never find a relationship that will satisfy them because the women themselves want singlehood. And this is critical because now as a man you become more controlling in your relationship due to the fear of losing a companion. You don't want to make sure that your woman or whoever you are around can ever access narratives that are feminist because you fear that your woman might just leave you in all cases, and this is the fear that makes you more manipulative, that makes you more controlling, that makes you restrict the freedom of that woman that you are around. Third, this obviously does not happen on a comparative, and I do want to weigh up or impact our argument here. Obviously, this means that on their side of the house, you have a lot more acts of passive aggression within your office spaces, within your college spaces, within your school spaces. Now men treat and act towards women like shit because they realize that these women are the same creatures that end up questioning their worth. They become preemptively more paranoid that these men, that these women will obviously shame you in all points of time and do not believe that you are worth anything. And this is where you become far more passive aggressive in office spaces. You become more misogynistic in the ways in which you talk. You probably in the worst case have more things like sexual harassment and sexual assault because you believe that these women are worthless, and hence as a result of it you act in extreme ways. Even if you don't believe the extreme impact, in obviously normal day-to-day instances, you just have women who feel far more insecure because they don't know the sort of men that surround them, that you fear for your life or you fear for the people that are around you because they might just be misogynistic. And these are the narratives that become far stronger because more men believe in these narratives. They believe that they are called worthless and hence they should act in a way that makes women worthless. Now, on a comparative, what happens? There are obviously three things. First, you do not create the fear that these things that these things can be changed, because on our side of the house, becoming an equal man in a relationship is far easier than changing your gender altogether. You are not shamed for being a man, but rather you can change the fact or you can change your relationship dynamics. So men aren't nearly as fearful about the ways in which they act within the relationship because they realize that these are tangible changes that they can make. Secondly, this seems obviously a lot more reasonable. Family and society constantly keeps telling you that you must get into a relationship, but on their side of the house, Andrew Tate can only ever be effective when you fear that you might just be dying single, that you fear that men or that other women around you might never give you a chance. This is why Andrew Tate becomes far stronger on their side. On our side of the house, when you do realize that there is an opt into relationships and that there are certain tangible changes that are possible for you to make, there is no reason for you to opt out of those changes. You realize that these are far lower barrier changes that you have to make and hence you can opt into it. So this is a comparative harm. The second thing to note here is that this obviously affects young children the most because young children are the most impressionable and they end up engaging with things like the manosphere obviously. These are the people who can't opt out of the things like manosphere because these come on their social media algorithms or are spread by their friends, spread by their family members or whatever. And this is terrible because young children growing up misogynistic is the worst thing that can happen because you grow up misogynistic and it's far harder to change old habits. When you start believing in old habits over and over again, this becomes who you are. This becomes the misogynistic person that you will be at all points of time. This has the longest impact within the debate in terms of just the men in general becoming far more misogynist.
All the men on our bench and burdens on women to be better. Men have to choose between becoming incels or being slightly better so they can get laid. What changes there are? I'll just explain what changes there are.
Okay, now on weighing, there are three ways in which we weigh off the entire drop-off. Firstly, there is no comparative on opening opposition because you do not know what happens as a result of you not opting into singlehood. At best they say that men might become more antagonistic, but there is no explanation at opening opposition as to what are the ways in which they become more antagonistic. Why do we have such a critical fear in your mind? Why is that you question your self-worth? We're the only thing that explains why the ways in which you question your self-worth makes you more insecure and makes you more misogynistic in the long term. Secondly, men microaggressions burden is obviously missing on their side of the house. We explain the sheer scale of it, the ways in which the social media narrative propagates, the number of people that obviously opt into this narrative, the number of people that engage with this narrative is significantly larger on our side of the house than ever explained by opening opposition. Lastly, men obviously do not need to be antagonized, and this beats the entire government because we explained to you that good men can still be platformed, good men can still be talked about, and these good men can still make you feel that okay, at the very least, men are not all shit creatures, but rather there are certain things that men do might be shit. This is enough to not make you feel insecure because at the very least you know what sort of men you have to become, and this is enough for you to not feel worthless just because of your gender.